7 months into my pregnancy, I accidentally overheard a conversation between my husband and the poor student I had been sponsoring. Emilio, if your wife finds out that the baby in her womb is actually our fertilized egg, don't you think she might get so upset that she'd take her own life? Renata asked with a soft laugh. That would be ideal, Emilio replied coldly. That way, all her assets would become mine. The only problem is if she decides to divorce me and throw me out. That's why we need to keep this secret. Once our child inherits her assets, we'll deliver a crushing blow. That night, I pretended I hadn't heard anything. I gave birth to the baby and raised him with the utmost care. 24 years later, after my son returned from studying abroad, I transferred all my company's shares and assets into his name. At a press conference, Renata, the poor student from years ago, showed up holding my husband's arm and clutching a maternity test report. She walked straight toward me and declared, Julian is my biological son. You've taken him from me all these years. It's time you give him back. My son then threw a divorce agreement in my face, his words cold and merciless. Hurry up and divorce my dad so we can finally be together as a family of 3. Considering you gave birth to me and raised me, I'll give you a monthly allowance of 200. I offered a faint smile and replied, all right. Mariana, weren't you supposed to attend a board meeting at the company today? Why are you still working in the study? Emilio entered with a cup of warm milk, placing it gently in front of me, his voice as tender as always. I closed my laptop and smiled at him. Julian's teacher mentioned he's been coughing a little lately. I've arranged for him to see the best pediatric specialist tomorrow. Moved, Emilio stroked my hair and said, You always worry so much when Julian has even the slightest discomfort. When he grows up, he'll surely repay your kindness with filial devotion. I looked at him with determination and replied, Of course, I'm Julian's mother. If I don't take care of him, who will? Emilio smiled warmly, touched by my words. You're amazing. Marrying you and raising a child together has been the greatest blessing of my life. I gazed into his affectionate eyes, offering him a faint smile without saying a word. We had been together for 10 years, 3 years of dating and 7 years of marriage. During this decade, Emilio had always taken care of me when I was sick or tired, surprised me in unexpected ways, and held me tightly in moments of passion, whispering that he would love me forever. Had I not overheard that conversation that day, I would never have believed that the man who professed to love me so much could betray me in such a way. Tia Renata, you're finally here! Julian's excited voice suddenly echoed from the living room. I immediately got up and left the study, only to see Renata walking through the door. Effortlessly, she picked up my son in her arms and planted a playful kiss on his cheek. Baby Julian, did you miss me? She said as her gaze landed on me. Her smile froze and her expression briefly turned awkward. Before I could say anything, Emilio quickly stepped forward to explain. Dear, there was an outdoor parent-child activity at Julian's kindergarten today. I thought you'd be busy with work, so I didn't want to bother you. I asked Renata to help. Renata put Julian down and nervously added, Yes, Mariana. You've supported me for so many years. I've always been grateful and wanted to repay your kindness. As soon as Emilio called, I rushed over. Watching their clumsy attempts to cover their guilt, I couldn't help but recall the day my son was born. Renata had also accompanied Emilio to the hospital under the pretense of visiting the baby, staying by his side while I endured labor. At that moment, Renata was incredibly excited, pacing back and forth in the hallway, nervously wringing her hands. When she saw that I had given birth to a boy, she immediately ran over, grabbing the baby and refusing to let him go. Her eyes were filled with joy, reddened from emotion. The nurse, unable to hold back a laugh, teased her. Who are you to the baby? You seem more excited than the mother. Renata felt embarrassed, but quickly tried to explain herself when she noticed I was silent. Mariana, I couldn't help it. Julian is so adorable that I accidentally gave him a kiss. You're not mad, are you? I smiled faintly and replied calmly, Of course not. I'm so busy with work that I sometimes neglect my family. I'm grateful you're willing to help take care of Julian. Hearing this, both Renata and Emilio breathed a sigh of relief. My son then ran toward me, his innocent eyes looking straight into mine as he asked, Mom, are you going to the office today or will you come to kindergarten with Dad and me? I gently stroked his head and asked, What does Julian want Mom to do? Without hesitation, he replied, I want Mom to go to work so Aunt Renata can take Dad and me to kindergarten. As if afraid Julian might say something inappropriate, Emilio quickly picked him up and explained to me, Darling, Julian just wants to make sure you're not distracted from work. Last time, he even told me not to bother you because you're working so hard. Renata nodded in agreement. Julian is such a thoughtful child. With someone as remarkable as you, Mariana, it's no wonder you have such an obedient son. Smiling, I said to my son, "All right, we'll do as Julian says." Hearing this, Julian jumped with joy. He completely ignored my presence, grabbing Renata's and Emilio's hands and pulling them toward the door. Watching their happy little family of three, I allowed a faint smile to cross my face. I turned and returned to my study to continue my pending work. Perhaps they thought I was easy to deceive, that I would never notice anything unusual, and so Renata became bolder with each passing day. At first, she sneaked around with Emilio while I was at work, but now, even when I was home, she found all kinds of excuses to visit.
Mariana, I've been learning to cook recently. I wanted to make something delicious to thank you for all your help over the years.
Mariana, I just got back from the countryside and brought some local specialties for you. Mariana, I left my job to start a business, but I'm short on initial funds. Could you help me out? Although I knew deep down that Renata's visits were just excuses to see my son and Emilio, I never turned her away. Every time she came, I always welcomed her courteously and even agreed to all her requests for help. Emilio seemed delighted with this arrangement. Whenever Renata came over, his lips would curl into an uncontrollable smile. Sometimes, he even openly flirted with her in front of me, exchanging knowing looks and secret smiles. Even my son grew increasingly attached to Renata, to the point of buying her a pair of slippers so she could visit us whenever she wanted. This life continued until the university entrance exams for my son. On the day the results were released, Renata arrived early at our house to wait with us. When we saw my son's surprisingly low score, Emilio frowned angrily. "How could you score so low?" he snapped. My son, however, remained unfazed. "So what? Our family has money. Mom can buy me a place at any school I want," Julian declared indifferently. Emilio shot me a subtle glance. Seeing that I didn't react, he continued, "Your mother may love you, but she can't spoil you like this. Managing the company on her own isn't easy for her. You need to show some ambition. How else will you be able to help her or make her confident enough to hand the company over to you someday?" Renata interjected seriously. "Julian, your father is right. While Mariana is your mother and will always care for you, you need to develop your own abilities. Otherwise, how will you earn the respect of seasoned executives when you take over the company?" Watching how they supported each other, I smiled faintly and replied calmly, "It's all right. I've already planned everything for Julian. I'll send him abroad to continue his studies. Once he returns, he'll naturally take over the company. After all, everything I have is for Julian." Hearing this, the three of them smiled with satisfaction. I smiled too, but for a different reason. They thought I was naive. I thought they were laughably foolish. During the process of organizing his studies abroad, I took my son to the company every day, teaching him the ins and outs of the business without holding back. On the day of his departure, Emilio accompanied him to the airport, holding his hand tightly, his face filled with reluctance. Renata also made a special trip, bringing a pile of items for my son, fussing over his life in a foreign country. The two gave him endless reminders, creating a warm and touching scene, a true portrait of worried parents sending their child off. After my son boarded the plane, they watched it ascend into the sky, their eyes brimming with tears until it disappeared from view. Only then did they leave, reluctantly, tears still glistening. Once my son went abroad, Renata visited our house less frequently, but Emilio started going out more often. Whenever he came back, he seemed completely exhausted. When I asked about it, he'd say he was out with friends or had joined a gym to stay in shape. On days when he ran out of excuses, he'd feign sadness, sighing dramatically. "I raised Julian with my own hands. He's never been away from me for so long. I can't help but miss him. If I don't find something to occupy myself, I'll fall apart." Ignoring the lingering scent of Renata's signature perfume on him, I smiled and reassured him. "Julian will be back soon. Then we can all be together again." Emilio's lips curved into a faint smile laden with hidden meaning. "Yes, soon. Our family of three will be reunited." 4 years later, my son returned from studying abroad. As usual, Renata arrived at my house early, accompanying Emilio and me to the airport. The moment they saw my son, neither Renata nor Emilio could contain themselves, running toward him to embrace him tightly as if no one else existed. After their emotional reunion, my son walked directly toward me and got straight to the point. "Mom, I'm back. When will you hand over the company to me?" Seeing his eagerness, I smiled calmly and said, "Come, I've already arranged a press conference. I'll officially hand everything over in front of everyone." At the press conference, the room was packed to capacity. Journalists, prominent figures, and business elites had gathered to witness the historic moment of the leadership transfer of Stellar Zinc Group. Under the attentive gaze of the crowd, I announced, "My son Julian will assume the position of the new president of Stellar Zinc Group." Under the watchful eyes of lawyers and the press cameras, I signed the transfer agreement, officially handing over all my assets and company shares to my son. Thunderous applause erupted, and the crowd was filled with admiration. Many commented on the profound bond between mother and son, their eyes brimming with envy as they looked at my son. Just then, Renata made an elegant late entrance, arm in arm with Emilio. The room fell silent. Confusion and surprise etched onto everyone's faces as Renata produced a paternity test report. In a loud voice, she declared, "Mariana, the truth is that the child you gave birth to years ago came from the fertilized egg of Emilio and me. I am Julian's biological mother. Allowing him to call you mom for over 20 years was already enough repayment for carrying him in your womb. Now it's time for you to give him back to me. I need to share with you what happened today because I feel like my heart is going to burst. I swear, not even the telenovelas we love so much can compare to what I experienced. Sit down, because this is going to be long." While Renata made her dramatic announcement about being Julian's true mother, it felt as if time had stopped. The conference room, packed with journalists and business people, fell into complete silence. I could hear the sound of my own heartbeat, calm and steady, as I watched the triumphant smiles of the three traders standing before me. "Mariana," Renata said in that syrupy voice I've come to despise, "aren't you going to say anything? Aren't you surprised to discover that all these years you've been raising my son?" And I remember looking her directly in the eyes at that moment, those eyes that had so often feigned gratitude while plotting to destroy me. A faint smile played on my lips, and I saw her expression of triumph falter slightly. "Of course I have something to say," I replied with a calmness that seemed to unsettle them. "In fact, I've prepared a presentation especially for this moment." I watched as Emilio, my beloved husband, exchanged a nervous glance with Renata. Julian, my son, no, their son, stood there with the same arrogant smile he had perfected during his years abroad. I walked to the podium and plugged my USB into the projector. The giant screen behind me lit up with the logo of Stellar Zinc Group. But it wasn't the same as usual. Something about it was different, something that visibly made Emilio tense up. "Dear guests," I began, my voice clear and firm, "today you will not only witness a change in leadership, but something much more revealing." I pressed the button on the remote, and the first slide appeared. It was a photo from exactly 7 months ago, the day I accidentally overheard that infamous conversation between Emilio and Renata. Their faces turned pale as they recognized the date and location. "You see," I continued, "some time ago, I discovered something fascinating about the true character of certain people. And as a good businesswoman, I decided to do what I do best, invest in the future." Murmurs filled the room. Journalists pulled out their recorders and frantically took notes. I could see sweat forming on Emilio's forehead as Renata gripped her designer handbag so tightly her knuckles turned white. Julian stepped forward, trying to regain control of the situation. "Mom, what are you doing? You already signed the transfer. Everything is mine now." My smile widened as I pressed the button again. "Oh, my dear Julian, always so impatient, just like your real mother. But you know what? Sometimes patience is the best teacher." The next slide revealed something that made Renata let out a small gasp. It was a complete record of all her visits to my house, every secret meeting with Emilio, every cent she had borrowed from me for her businesses, all meticulously documented, with dates, amounts, and recordings. "As you can see," I continued, now addressing the journalists, "this is a fascinating story of loyalty, betrayal, and justice." My heart was pounding, but my voice remained steady. 24 years of pain, of pretending not to know anything, of building my plan step by step were about to bear fruit. And this was only the beginning. The camera flashes began to flicker like crazed fireflies as I prepared to reveal the next part of my presentation. The real bombshell was about to drop, and I knew none of them were ready for what was coming. Do you want to know what happened next? Because I swear what follows is even more unbelievable. Friends, forgive the pause, but I needed to take a breath before telling you what came next. I still tremble remembering their faces in that moment. As the flashes of cameras continued to illuminate the room, I pressed the next button. On the screen appeared a document that made Emilio nearly faint, the actual financial statements of Stellar Zinc Group. "As you can see," I said, pointing to the figures, "over the past 5 years, I have been quietly restructuring all our assets. What I handed over to Julian today is nothing but an empty shell.
Renata stepped forward, her perfect mask of confidence beginning to crack.
That's impossible. We've been monitoring every move the company makes. A soft laugh escaped my lips. Did you really think that after 24 years of running this empire, I wouldn't know how to play my moves without you noticing? Every time you came to my house with your fake smiles, keeping an eye on my actions, I was 3 steps ahead. Julian, clad in his designer Italian suit and exuding the arrogance inherited from Renata, tried to cut me off. The documents you signed are legally binding. Oh, my dear Julian, I replied sweetly. Do you remember all those business lessons I gave you? It seems you weren't paying enough attention. What I signed today was the transfer of Stellar Zinc Holdings, a company I created 6 months ago that holds nothing but debts and liabilities. Emilio's face turned a sickly green as I projected the next document. A series of bank transfers showing how he had been siphoning funds from the company to support Renata for years. Yep. You know, I continued, now addressing the journalist directly, it's fascinating how careless people can be when they think they've already won. For instance, did you ever wonder why I so readily agreed to send Julian abroad? The murmurs in the room grew louder as I revealed the next set of images, photos of Renata and Emilio at various locations during the years Julian was away, spending money like there was no tomorrow while I supposedly remained oblivious at home. During those 4 years, while you celebrated your impending victory, I was establishing a new corporation, Phoenix Global Enterprises. All of our most valuable contracts, patents, and business relationships were quietly transferred to this new entity. Renata's face drained of all color as I displayed the next document, a comprehensive list of properties and bank accounts she and Emilio had accumulated using company funds. Funds that will now have to be returned, I added with a smile. And you know what's most interesting? I paused, letting the tension build. The Phoenix Global Board of Directors is already aware of all of this. In fact, they're holding an extraordinary meeting as we speak, voting to remove everyone involved in this little family drama. Julian lunged toward the podium, but 2 security guards gently restrained him. You can't do this to us! Renata screamed, her carefully constructed mask of dignity completely shattered. I'm his biological mother! Calmly, I removed my glasses and looked her directly in the eye. You know, Renata, being a mother isn't just about carrying a child in your womb. It's about protecting him, educating him, loving him unconditionally, even when you know he's being manipulated by people like you. The journalists were practically euphoric, furiously taking notes as I continued with my presentation. But what was coming next? Oh, friends! This was the moment that would leave them breathless. Do you want to know what else I had up my sleeve? Because this is just the beginning. Oh, friends! Take a sip of water because what comes next is even more intense. I swear, even I could hardly believe what I was about to reveal. With the room completely silent, I projected the next document. It was a detailed report from the in vitro fertilization clinic, but not just any report. You see, I said, adjusting my pearl necklace, a gift from Emilio on our 10th anniversary. When I discovered the truth about the pregnancy, I did something none of you expected. I investigated the clinic thoroughly. Renata let out a nervous laugh. And so what? Everyone already knows the baby is mine. My smile widened as I pressed the next button. On the screen appeared the face of Dr. Martinez, the physician who had performed the procedure. Do you remember Dr. Martinez? I asked, looking directly at Renata. What a coincidence that he died in an accident right after Julian was born, don't you think? Renata's face twisted into a mask of terror. Emilio tried to approach me, but the guards held him back. Mariana, darling, don't go down this path, he pleaded, his voice trembling. Why not, my love? Are you afraid I'll tell everyone how you and Renata bribed the doctor to swap the embryos? Or are you worried I'll reveal the evidence that the accident involving Dr. Martinez wasn't so accidental? The camera flashes intensified. The journalists were practically salivating over each new revelation. But that's not all, I continued, my voice steady despite the lump in my throat. Did you know that Dr. Martinez left a confession letter before he died? A letter his wife handed to me exactly 23 years ago. Julian, who had maintained his arrogant demeanor until that point, began to show signs of nervousness. Why did you wait so long? He asked, his voice cracking slightly. If you knew all this, why did you raise me? I stepped closer to him, holding back the tears threatening to fall. Because despite everything, I loved you from the moment I held you in my arms. Every sleepless night when you were sick, every achievement we celebrated together, every hug, all of it was real, but true love also means teaching hard lessons. At that moment, the conference room doors opened. An elegant older woman entered, causing Renata to nearly faint. Allow me to introduce Mrs. Carmen Martinez, the doctor's widow, I announced. She has some interesting things to share about the day Julian was conceived. Mrs. Carmen approached the podium, pulling a yellowed envelope from her handbag. For 24 years, I stayed silent out of fear, she began, her voice trembling with emotion. But no longer. She held up the envelope. My husband documented everything Renata and Emilio forced him to do and how they threatened him afterward. Renata tried to bolt toward the exit, but the guards stopped her. Emilio collapsed into a chair, defeated, while Julian stared at his biological parents with a mix of horror and disgust. But there's still more, I said, preparing to reveal the final and most devastating part of my plan. Because you see, while you were all busy plotting to steal my fortune, I discovered something that will change everything forever. Friends, I need to take a breath before I tell you the last part. What comes next is something even the most dramatic of telenovelas couldn't have imagined. Forgive the pause, but I needed a moment to catch my breath. What I was about to reveal would change our lives forever. I stepped back to the podium, feeling the weight of 2 decades of secrets pressing down on my shoulders. The entire room held its breath, waiting for my next move. For the past 24 years, I began, my voice clear and firm, I haven't just built a business empire, I also created a secret foundation called Mothers of the Heart, dedicated to helping women who have been victims of fertility clinic fraud. I projected documents from the foundation onto the screen, alongside photos of hundreds of smiling women. And do you know who funds this foundation? I asked, smiling as I switched to the next slide. 90% of the shares of Stellar Zinc Group, which I've been quietly transferring over the past 5 years. Julian turned pale. So what you gave me today is just 10% of a company that's practically bankrupt, I finished, barely enough to cover the debts Emilio and Renata have been accumulating in your name. Renata lunged at me, but the guards restrained her. You can't do this! You'll destroy your own son's future! She screamed. I removed my glasses and looked her directly in the eye. My son? I replied, my voice firm but calm. The same one who threw divorce papers in my face just hours ago and offered me a miserable $200 pension? No, Renata. You and Emilio destroyed him long before I had the chance. At that moment, Mrs. Carmen stepped forward with another envelope. This, she said, handing me the documents, is my husband's full confession about how you two blackmailed him into falsifying documents for other families. Yours wasn't the only case. The journalists were practically leaping from their seats, flashes illuminating the room as I projected a list of names. Other families who had fallen victim to the same scheme at the clinic. That's why, I continued, all the money you thought you were inheriting will now serve a better purpose, helping other women and families who have suffered as I did. Emilio, who had been silent until then, finally spoke. Mariana, please, we can work something out. Think of all our years together. A solitary tear rolled down my cheek as I pressed the last button on the remote control. The image that appeared on the screen made everyone in the room gasp. It was a photo of Emilio and Renata at the clinic on the very day they planned everything, complete with the date and timestamp. You know what's the saddest part, Emilio? I said, my voice trembling only slightly. While you and Renata were plotting to destroy me, I genuinely loved all of you. You, Julian. I even tried to be kind to Renata, but true love cannot be built on lies. The guards began escorting Emilio and Renata toward the exit as 2 police officers entered the room. The authorities now have all the documentation regarding the fraud at the clinic and the accident involving Dr. Martinez, I announced. They also have evidence of embezzlement and tax evasion. Julian, completely defeated, looked at me with tears in his eyes. Mom, I raised my hand to stop him. No, Julian. I am no longer your mother. I am the woman who gave you all her love for 24 years and received nothing but betrayal in return. Now you'll have to learn to live with the consequences of your choices. And then, friends, something happened that no one expected. Oh, friends, you can't imagine what came next. My heart still races at the memory. As the police handcuffed Emilio and Renata, a young woman rushed into the room. It was Diana, my personal assistant for the past 5 years, but there was something different about her. Her eyes were filled with tears and she clutched a folder tightly to her chest. Wait! She shouted, her voice echoing through the room. There's something else everyone needs to know! Julian, who had seemed completely defeated, lifted his head with curiosity. Diana approached the podium and looked at me with a mix of admiration and affection I had never seen before. Mrs. Mariana, she began, her voice trembling with emotion.
Forgive me for not telling you this sooner, but I am Dr. Martinez's daughter.
The murmurs in the room grew louder. Renata tried to break free from the police officers, but it was useless. My father, Diana continued, didn't just leave a confession letter. He also kept a detailed journal of every procedure performed at the clinic. With trembling hands, she opened the folder and pulled out a yellow document. The day the in vitro fertilization procedure was performed, Diana paused dramatically, there was a mistake. A mistake my father discovered later but was forced by Renata and Emilio to conceal. What mistake? Julian asked, his voice barely a whisper. Diana looked at me, silently asking for permission. I nodded, even though my heart was pounding so loudly I was sure everyone could hear it. The egg used... Diana took a deep breath. It belonged to Mrs. Mariana. The silence that followed was deafening. Renata let out a choked gasp, while Emilio collapsed to his knees. What are you saying? Renata demanded, her voice cracking. My father accidentally swapped the eggs, Diana explained. By the time he realized it, Julian had already been conceived. You threatened him to keep the secret, but he documented everything, Diana continued. I clutched my chest, feeling as though the world was spinning around me. All these years, all the lies. Julian approached me slowly, his eyes brimming with tears.
So, you're really my mother?
I always was, I replied softly, with or without blood ties.
Renata began screaming hysterically, You're lying. This is impossible. Diana pulled out more documents from the folder.
I have the DNA test my father secretly conducted. I've kept them all these years, waiting for the right moment.
The journalists were in a frenzy, snapping photos and taking notes, but I could only focus on Julian. My son, my true son. Mama, he whispered, falling to his knees before me. Please forgive me, forgive me. And then, my friends, something happened that would change our lives forever. Brace yourselves for the ending of this story, because what happened next still leaves me trembling to this day. As Julian knelt before me, I felt all the pain and bitterness of the past 24 years melting away like snow under the sun. I looked into his eyes I now knew were truly mine, and saw in them the same pain and regret I had carried all these years. Stand up, my son, I said softly, extending my hand to him. But before he could take it, Renata made her final desperate move. With a force no one expected, she broke free from the police and ran toward us. If I can't have him, no one will, she screamed, pulling something from her purse. Everything happened in slow motion. I saw the metallic glint of scissors in her hand. Without thinking, I stepped between her and Julian. The guards subdued her before she could cause any harm, but the moment was captured by every journalist's camera in the room. Do you see now, Renata? I said as the police handcuffed her again. This is what it means to be a mother. It's not just giving birth. It's being willing to lay down your life for your child, no matter the circumstances. Emilio, who had been in shock since the revelations began, finally spoke. All this time, we fooled ourselves into thinking we could steal true love. Diana stepped forward with more documents. There's more, she said, handing me an envelope. My father left specific instructions for this to be delivered today. It's his full testimony about how Renata and Emilio blackmailed him and how they planned his accident. The police took Renata and Emilio away, this time for good. The cameras continued to flash, capturing every moment of this incredible conclusion. Julian approached me trembling. All these years, he whispered, wasted because of their ambition and my blindness. I embraced him tightly, as I had longed to do since overhearing that conversation 7 months ago. They weren't wasted, my son. Every moment I spent with you, every sacrifice, every smile, it was all worth it. How can you forgive me after everything I've done to you? He asked, his eyes filled with tears. I smiled gently as I wiped his tears away. Because a mother's true love knows no limits. And now, thanks to the truth coming to light, we can start over. Diana approached with one last revelation. The Mothers of the Heart Foundation has already helped over 1,000 families uncover the truth about similar cases. Mrs. Mariana didn't just save her own family, she's changing the lives of countless others. The journalist broke into spontaneous applause. Social media exploded with the story. Within hours, we became a symbol of hope for families in similar situations. That night, as Julian and I had dinner together at home, just like in the old days, he looked at me with new eyes. Mama, will you give me another chance to be the son you deserve? I placed my hand over his on the table and smiled. My son, you've always had that chance. Because true love doesn't just forgive, it is reborn.
And so, my friends, my story came to an end.
Renata and Emilio were sentenced to prison for multiple charges. The foundation continues to grow each day, helping more families. And Julian, my Julian is now studying law.